friends. Tonight I am painting this wonderful little amaryllis. My mom gets these every year. They come in that big bulb, which I just love, and then they bloom usually at Christmas, although I'll tell you my mom's bloom in her garden in the summertime, which is always interesting. They're quite prolific. So just to touch on our supplies real quickly here, I'm going to be using my regular 8 Velvet Touch round, which you know I love. Just love the short handle. I love the feel and the point. I also lately have been keeping on hand my 6 long round, which I really love because I can get into some tight spaces that are a little bit easier with the 6 round versus my 8. So I like having that. And if you guys are using this Delgado, these are great as well, as you know, for my beginners. If you don't want to invest in your Princetons yet, play around with these Delgados. You can get a whole set of, I think there's 10 in a pack, and they're under $15. And I've been quite happy with them. I've been using them for about 5 months. So I drew my amaryllis, of course, using my Blackwing pencils. You know, I love this because of that fun little eraser that's replaceable, and you don't end up with a bunch of pencils like this that have no erasers. So I love this one because I can just keep replacing that little eraser. So I drew my amaryllis on here, and I have got just a reminder, make sure you have your wash water and your rinse water. I've got my great little ceramic Meeden water well, which I love because it doesn't knock over and it just feels kind of indulgent, so I like it. I will be using my MeiLang paints, Paul Rubens MeiLangs, because I wanted to play with these metallics in the bottom here. If you do have the other MeiLang palette, that's fine too. This one, it's the same, except for this one has this row of metallics at the bottom. So I bought both because I'm using a lot of metallics right now for the holidays. But as you know, I love these Paul Rubens. They're really creamy and vibrant, and I've been refilling them with my Paul Rubens tubes. So I had a couple of you ask me about that. You know, what happens when you use one of the pans? I just refill them with the tubes. And then I've got my Artisto paper, but I'm using today because this is going to be a gift. So I wanted to use my 9x12 paper. As you know, I normally use the little journal papers and like this. And I do love these for my daily practices because I like to keep these and journal them, keep them for the seasons. If I do want to gift one, I just tear it out along the perforations here, but I have tons and tons of these, and I just love them. They're really thick, I think great student grade paper. So that's what I'm using, except in the larger side since I'm gifting it. So let's go ahead and get started. The amaryllis my mom has are always quite a bright pink or red color. So I'm going to play around with kind of my rose red, which I love, in Winsor Newton, which I don't paint with every day because they're a little bit pricey for my daily painting. And so I kind of like these two colors together. This reminds me a little bit of almost an opera rose in Winsor Newton, or your Quin Magenta, which is just fine. And then I'll be using my sap and my olive green, which I mix together. That's kind of my go-to green and just what I kind of gravitate towards. So I'll be using that variety of colors, and then I'll be leaving white space in here. So I think that'll be fun for you guys if you want to give it a try and paint along with me here. So let's go ahead and get started. Keep a little, I always keep these little scratch papers nearby because when you're painting, I like to be able to have all the different values. So I've got my dark value, kind of my mid value, and my light value because it creates that fun depth and interest in your paintings. So I always keep this little piece here so I can test out my paints before I go on to my paper. All right, so we're going to start with, let's see, the colors I am using are going to be, you could use any of these MeiLang reds. I'm going to focus a little bit on the rose red, the madder red. I kind of like those. But, you know, use the reds that appeal to you for sure. So I'm going to get some in my palette here, making sure when I go in to pick up my paint, I'm not going in with the tip of my brush, because we want to preserve those beautiful tips on our brush. And even these Degatos, I have been so surprised. I mean, I don't know if you can pick that up in the camera, but it's got a beautiful tip still. And I've been using these for about 5-6 months. So, you know, you beginners, this is a really great set. It also gives you all the different sizes. And for me, I love an 8 round, but when you buy this set, you get all the way from a 2 up to, I think, a 12. And you can kind of see which size you gravitate towards. So I'll get that link for you on Amazon. I've got the bright pink there, and then I'm also just going to mix some of the red. You could use alizarin crimson, you could use your madder red, ruby red, any of the reds that you kind of like. I say find those and go for those. So the reason I'm picking this darker red is so I can go into the creases and create a little depth in there. So we're going to start with, as always in watercolor, so important to start with your lightest values. And you can build up layers to add more color. So my darkest colors are going to be in the center, of course. And if you got my other drawing, I'm going to give you 2 drawings for this. One is very simple, and the other one is like this, and it has some curves and some twisted petals. So you can kind of decide which one you want to use first. I'm actually going to start with my pink, kind of pinker color. And I'm just going to go in and put a wash to set the colors I'm using. As well, I don't know if you can see, but there's the tiny little, I think they're called stigmas. I'm sure one of you can correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But these little stigmas, you could use some masking if you want to really make sure that you're not painting over them. For me, I don't use masking too often. Just kind of, I don't like sometimes I rip my paper trying to remove it, and it's just kind of a lot of work for me. So I just try to leave the white spaces. I'm going to leave a lot of white space in. You all ask me a lot about how do I determine where I'm leaving the white space. I'm going to leave a lot right in where I feel like the bend of the leaf might be. So kind of in the middle of the petals, I'm going to leave more white space. And then on the inner part of the flower, I'll have a little bit deeper, and on some of the edges. That just kind of makes sense to me. So I'm just going to go along in all of these. Let me picking up some of my color, and then I do this a lot of times to get a light wash. I will dip it in my water and leave some of the paint drops on the side, and then I can always go back to them and pick some more up. So I'm just going in with the tip of my brush. And make sure too that all of your lines, your veins, are curving around so they show that beautiful curvature of the petals, and you really get that feel for the curve of the petals. Just going to keep going here. And then we'll go in and we'll create some more depth and darker values as we go along. But I really just wanted to get some color on the paper so I have something to follow. And this is what I'm talking about. I will just go along the rim of my water dish and keep picking up some of that real watery paint that has a light value, just meaning it has more water in it. So as you can see, I came out, but I'm leaving this white space. Now my next color I will put in will be more along the edges. and maybe a little bit like that. And then I'll just go, and I think I'm gonna pick up my 6 to get some thinner lines, which, you know, if you have a really steady hand, you could probably get some pretty thin lines with this 8 round, but I don't quite have as steady a hand, so that's why I like this 6 round, and that's what I'm going to use to go in. Now, before that dries too much in these wet areas, I'm going to go in a little bit with that red and just dab in and get that really fun spread that we get with watercolors with the wet on wet, just like that. And I want the darker colors obviously to be in towards the center of the flower and coming out, and we'll darken that more and more. So I'm going around these little filaments and stigmas in here. There we go. Now you really could do that with, this is that push and pull technique, you know, I love. But what I was going to say is you could, it would probably be a little bit better to do this when the petal is still kind of wet, so you get a real nice soft blend and you don't really have to try and get rid of that line. A lot of times that's better. Okay, so I think that one's good. I'm going to go ahead and start on this one here. So I'm picking up more of that pink paint. Just going to go on the side of my dish here. And, you know, again, take your paper and just kind of practice. And you can say, yep, that's the value that I wanted. And you're just fine doing it that way. So I'm going to go in here and start working on this one from the center again, going around those little pieces. Just like that. And making sure your lines all curve back to the center of your flower. So my brush strokes are all guiding my eye towards the center of the flower, which is right here. That can really make a big difference when you're looking at a painting. If that's a little off and going in the wrong, the lines of the petals are going in the wrong directions, it can be really confusing for our brain. So make sure you pay attention to that, and just sometimes I hold my brush up and just make sure everything's pointing back in the right direction. So there we go. We've got a good foundation there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the outer edges of my flower and do the same thing. So I'm going to pick up some more of that light value paint, and this one I might just go ahead and do this whole side here like that, and then go around. I've got a little lip on this one. Now just use this process I'm kind of using if you are playing with the other drawing I gave you that looks a little bit different than this. And we drew in our first day, I showed you how to draw one of these flowers. That's fine too, you can still apply this. I'm going to pick up the tiniest, I mean tiniest bit of that red. And I'm just going to draw some very fine lines with this. Very light pressure. That's why, you know, practicing those brush strokes is so important, guys. because when I know I need to create a very fine line, I know what it's going to take for me to get that. It's holding your brush up and down and very light pressure. So let's go around and we'll just, I mean, I am so lightly touching into that red. Now, for me, I would probably never do this in the morning because I have my coffee in the morning. And could maybe get a shaky hand. This might be a good place too. You could almost use some dry brush because it would give you a little bit of that texture. But as you can see, this is working quite well. So I just keep going around my flower, making sure those lines are curving towards the center of my flower. I'm telling you guys, when you have a wonky flower, that's probably why, is because your lines are not going into the right direction. And we'll just keep going with that. I'm just putting tiny little feathering along the edges, and then we'll come back and do a little bit of a glazing to darken some of those. The other thing is I don't do just one line. I kind of break it up, meaning like I start and then I pick up. So it's just not one continuous line because I feel like that doesn't look as natural. Now I just used the side of my brush a little bit to get just a little broader stroke there. And then here. Sometimes I have to think about which way my lines need to go, because it can get a little confusing on some of those edges. There we go. Just gonna wash and rinse my brush and just very lightly soften that edge. Now red is very staining, so sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to lift. I'm also, if you watch, look at the white space I'm leaving in where I feel like the petal is bending over. I'm really being conscious of leaving some of that white space. Really important. It's going to make a very big difference on your flower. Kind of having that right feel. That and these lines. There we go. So I'm keeping in mind those white spaces and making sure I'm not filling them all in. Now we're going to go in and darken some of these centers with a light glaze. So let's go ahead and move on to our other one and do the same thing. Creating these lines. It's a little bit wet, so I got to be careful. Really, if you're right-handed, you should always start left to right. I forget that all the time. There we go. Let's see, what do we want to do with that? Now I'm just pressing into, when you see me do a little thicker line, that's because I'm putting a little more pressure on my brush. So I get a thicker line. I'm going into the belly of my brush, not just the tip or the toe here. And again, that's the importance of really practicing those brush strokes, so you know how much pressure, you know how to hold your hand, and you feel confident. And brush strokes too, you guys, are for those of you that tell me, like, I just can't get motivated to paint sometimes, or I sit down and then I don't know what to paint. You know, go to my little brush strokes and warm-ups video and practice those. Those are always good. Use colors you like, play with different brushes, and I promise you, I bet you, I guess I can't promise you, but I bet you that you will get in the mood, because I usually do. Once I start, sometimes it's just taking those first couple brush strokes and then you're like, oh, now I can't stop. And you get more, the more you develop that beautiful muscle memory of how to create brush strokes, you get more confident, and you want to sit down and paint, and you see things and your mind automatically says, oh, I know how to paint that. So just these tiny brush strokes all the way around. Just like that. So we've got lots of brush strokes here. And then I might just add some here. This 6 brush I just love. I've always thought, oh, you know what? Nothing can compare to my 8. But I really appreciate this 6. So I keep it around. And for the most part, I'm grabbing my Dagatos. I'm grabbing my 8. But a lot of times, I really appreciate this little 6 brush that I have. And it works really well and gives me just exactly that brush stroke and that line that I'm looking for. So I'm just very lightly going over with just a damp brush some of the areas that I know I'm going to fill in with some color. So again, I'm determining those white spaces by where I might see the bend in my flower, which is right in the middle of the petal. So this one, if you can see these, this looks like a bend in my flower. I'm going to pick up a tiny bit of that red. Now it might be too late. This might be dry. Yeah, it is. So ideally I would have went in there while that was wet, so we get that really pretty spread and blend. And I just keep going around with those brush strokes. You can also use the side of your brush. And then I'll go in and soften. Maybe a little bit in that one that's peeking out in the back here. Like that. Okay, now what I'm going to work on is I'm going to go into the stem. So my go-to green, if you've watched me for a while, my go-to, by the way, I'm switching back to my 8 because I want a little thicker stroke, not such fine detail as here. And I'm going to grab in my MeiLiang palette, I'm going to grab my typical green I use is a mixture of sap green and olive green. I don't know why, it's kind of my go-to. Occasionally I'll use this in the MeiLang palette. It's called the Tree Green, and I really actually like it because it's very light. So let's just go into our petal here and just putting down a few, using the tip of my brush, and I'm holding pretty close up on my ferrule so I have some control, and just going to start laying down that color, just some lines like that. Wonderful. And then I'll fill the other side in with maybe some yellow or some gold. For the shadows, I always bring in some of my flower color. Let me show you. And I mix it. And it just gives a really pretty coherency to the between the flower and the petal and the stem. It's going to have those undertones. So right now I'm really just using wet on wet and going in and just letting it kind of blend on its own like that. I'm going to wash and rinse my brush and just maybe blend that a tiny bit, not too much, because stems kind of have some veins and lines in them. I'm going to add just the slightest little touch of cad yellow here. Just a very tiny amount. Let me find, let's see, I'm running out of space here. Just a little bit. I'm going to add water to that. So it's about 70% water, 30% pigment, and then just tapping it off. I feel like I need to tap it off a tiny bit more and add some of that. Now notice I've got those white spaces in here again. Really important. And I love the way this is blending right here. I think that's really pretty and exactly what I wanted. Now, as I get to this kind of little bulb thicker part that's joined to the flower, what I'm going to do is mix a lot more of the color of the flower with some of that green, because I feel like as it gets closer to the flower, it's going to have a little bit more, and that's too much paint. So tapping off, using the tip of my brush, and I might even let a little bit of it start blending down the stalk. I'm going to go back to my 6 and just go in there with some of the green and get that real pretty washy look of all of them blending together, and maybe just pull some of that down. I will darken this side a bit. I feel like there should be a little bit more of a shadow on this side. Where it's kind of tucking in behind this petal. And look at that beautiful thin line I can get with this 6. There we go. Okay, I'm going to leave that. I think that is just fine. And let's go back to our flower here. So what I want to do is take some clean water, and I'm going to go in and just, let me think how I want to do this. I think actually what I'll do is create a glaze. So a glaze for me is I'm typically using a pretty light wash, meaning there's a lot of water, and I'm going to go in and glaze some of these areas using the side of my brush. So coming down here like that. Perfect. So I've got quite a bit of water there. I want to come here using the side of my brush I don't want to cover up any of that beautiful white space, remember. I'm really saving those. And I think the key here for me is always going to the side of my brush. So here's some more. Let's maybe do it in here. Just creating some of these shadows with the glaze. There we go. I might make it just a tiny bit darker. And side of my brush. Now notice even with these glazes, I'm following the curves of those petals. Laying my brush down on this side, and then some on the, using the point too. Go. And I actually don't mind those hard lines. I'm actually okay with that. I want to make sure I don't stick my hand in there. Just soften that line a little bit. Red can be a little bit tougher to soften the lines because it's so strong. As far as the color. There we go. So look at the beautiful whites. Now let's go ahead and do this one in the same way. Using the side of my brush, like that. Side of my brush here. I feel like I want it to be just a tad darker. Like that. Then I'll just soften that a bit. There we go. Yeah, I like that. Create some glazing in here, coming out. You've probably seen me do this glazing technique for some shadows with a lot of my flowers, actually. And there's an example of some dry brush. So many times when you're using the side of your brush, you're going to get that dry brush effect. Or I do, it seems. Go in here. Now this is where really, if you used some of that masking, it probably would be quite handy, but that's okay. We're gonna work with this. Okay, while that's kind of drying there, I'm going to go in. Actually, there's a little lip here on that. This petal and this one where the leaf kind of turns over. So I'm going to apply a tiny bit of a darker color on there. Just to show that shadow. And then you can push and pull just with a damp brush, just to blend it a bit. Okay, let's leave that alone and go on to our leaf here. So I'm going to use the tip of my leaf, point, and then spread it out, just applying pressure to that. Now that leaf is in the back, so I don't want to give it as much value in color, meaning that depth in color, because it's in the background. This one is a little bit closer. So I might make that a little bit darker, point, and then press into my brush and wrap it around. So this one can have a little bit more. I'm going to use a tiny bit of that yellow in there, just like that. I really want to keep those a little bit more in the back. I might add a tiny bit of that pink in here. Just like that. And maybe some of my dark green. There we go. Can maybe darken up that one in the back just a tad. And there we go. It looks like it's really inside there. Now I'm getting just a tad bit of a bloom here, so I'm just going to take a wet brush and kind of pick that up, that bloom up, and that would be how I fix that. Now there's a little bit of a white spot I lifted, so it makes it look like the brush is, the petal is kind of tipping over. Like that. Can do a little bit on this one. There you go. Okay, let's do this leaf in the back, and I'm going to try and make that one really washy because it's in the background. So point, pressing into my brush. But we don't want really any detail on this one in the back. We just want it to look like it's kind of faded into the background. Not quite as prominent as maybe some of these others, and definitely not the detail. There we go. Okay, so this one kind of comes down here. Again, not very light value, just meaning more water. And we're just going to leave that like it is. We didn't quite finish this one, so let's go ahead and finish that one out. Point, press, point, press. Can add in some of that pinkish red. Kind of makes it look like it's almost turning. And just a light wash with a light value, meaning more water, on this one because I want it to almost look like it's in shadow. So maybe some of that deeper, darker green. There we go. Okay, we're almost done, guys. Let's add just a tiny bit. I'm going to pick up some of that deeper, darker red. Let me see. Let's see what color is that. I want a little bit darker red for in the middle here. I'm painting very carefully around those little stamens. And we're going to go in and paint those a little bit more, but just darkening those up a bit. So you get that feeling of depth. Go in here. Grab a little bit more of that red. Oop, now I just stuck my hand in that, so don't do that. Clean off my brush a bit. Pick up some of that. So we're just darkening those centers, going in between those little things. And there we go. And then I think the last thing besides painting those yellow is I'm going to go in and just darken a few of these tips of the flowers, just a tiny bit. So I think the best way to do that is using a tiny bit of the side of my brush. But what I want to do very quickly before that dries is just go in and use that push-pull technique and feather that out. Now see, even with as quick as I just did that, because the red is so pigmented, it's a little bit tougher to blend, but that's okay. Add in a tiny bit, wet and wet here along the edges. And it just gives it some real interest. So immediately going in there, that one I didn't even go in quick enough, and using that push and pull technique just to add some interest to the ends of those petals. Like that, and then very quickly going in before it dries, and do a little bit of that push and pull, maybe on this one here too. I'm actually going to go in where this kind of folds over very quickly, soften that edge, and push and pull this one. There we go. Look at how pretty that is. Really interesting for your eye. So here's a fold over on that petal. So I'm going to go in, and my paper is drying rather quickly today for some reason. I do have my heater on quite a bit. And you can do this on the edges of all of these. I think works really well. Going in, push and pull, making sure that the direction you're pulling in is leading down towards the center of the flower. Otherwise you're going to get kind of a funky look. Let's do this one here. And push and pull. There you go. And then you can go into and just add a little bit more, like that. Want it a little bit darker. This is when that push and pull technique is really wonderful. But you gotta be quick, because once it dries, you're not gonna get that beautiful flow. Maybe a little bit underneath here. And then push and pull. There we go. Very pretty. Now this might have a little bit of a shadow, so I'm going to pick some of that paint up and create a glaze and create a shadow, but I still maintain those white spaces. Now what you can do on these that have that little bit of a turn, a little bit of a lip, is just go along the outside and create a little shadow so it looks like it's turning over. This 6 brush, you guys, is really wonderful if you're looking for a new brush to get. I couldn't suggest it more. I'm really kind of surprised how much I'm using it. And I might add a little shadow under here. There we go. Yeah. I think this is pretty much done, you guys. Oh, we need to add in those yellow little doohickeys. So I'm going to grab some of my yellow, and I'm going to keep it a little bit watery because I want to go in and add some maybe burnt umber or something to them. So there's a little bit of a mix. Okay. Let me grab that dark brown. I think that's my Van Dyke brown. Woo, and it is dark, guys. And just touch in here and there. Let the paint kind of move it around. There we go. Now I may play with this a little bit more when I hang up, but I think this is pretty good. I like this, and I don't like to get too much detail. So, you know, depending on if you like more detail, you could certainly go in and add some lines like I'm doing right now. It's kind of up to you. But I really like the simplicity. So there you go, everybody. I may go in and just add a little bit more red on some of these other edges, but I think I'm pretty much done and pretty happy with how this turned out. Let me just get a little bit of that. That'll be my last one. Pushing, pulling, making sure I'm turning my brush and not getting rid of all that white space. Well, now that I did that, I feel like the one next to it needs a little, right? And I think it will also make it pop against that leaf. So push and pull, but not covering up the white spaces that I created. Don't want to do that. All right, I think we are about done. I hope you give this a try. If you would like the drawing, I will have it on my website. It's free, of course, and I'll do a little tutorial kit if you want to get the swatch and all that fun stuff. They're only $2.50. And a lot of you really are enjoying those. All right, there you go. I will list all my supplies in the description. I also just have one link. You can go to my Amazon store. It has all these fun brushes and paints and things in there for you. So thank you so much, everybody. Always fun, and I hope you give this beautiful little amaryllis a try, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, most of all, have fun. Happy painting, everyone.